A poor farmer is despised in a luxurious stable, but what he says leaves everyone speechless. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Oak Ridge Stables, the most prestigious horse breeding facility in Kentucky. Located just outside of Lexington, in the heart of thoroughbred country, Oak Ridge wasn't just a stable, it was a monument to wealth and status. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you're watching from. We're keeping it going. Ethan Miller, a weathered man in his mid-50s with calloused hands and worn overalls, walked slowly through the main entrance, carrying a basket of fresh produce. His truck, an ancient Ford pickup with peeling paint and a temperamental engine, looked hopelessly out of place among the luxury vehicles in the parking area. As he crossed the threshold into the main building, he felt the stares immediately, a mixture of confusion and disdain from the impeccably dressed staff who moved about with practiced efficiency. "Can I help you?" asked Jessica Barnes, the receptionist, her voice carrying a note of suspicion as she eyed his mud-stained boots and sun-weathered face. "Morning, ma'am," Ethan replied with a gentle smile. "I brought some fresh vegetables from my garden. Thought the staff might appreciate them." His voice was soft, but carried a quiet dignity that seemed to hang in the air. Jessica exchanged glances with Mark Wilson, the stable manager who had appeared at her side. Mark's tailored uniform contrasted sharply with Ethan's threadbare flannel shirt. "We order our produce from approved vendors," Mark said dismissively. "This isn't a farmer's market." From the far end of the corridor, a tall, imposing figure emerged. Richard Blackwood, owner of Oak Ridge Stables, walked with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. His custom-made suit probably cost more than Ethan earned in months. "What's going on here?" Richard demanded, his voice cutting through the tension. "Just a local trying to sell his vegetables, sir," Mark explained with a smirk. "I was just sending him on his way." Richard's gaze fell on Ethan, a look of contempt barely concealed behind practiced politeness. "I'm afraid we don't accept unsolicited goods, Mr. Miller." "Ethan Miller," the farmer replied, meeting Richard's eyes without flinching. "And I wasn't looking to sell anything. Just thought I'd share the season's first harvest, no charge." Richard was about to dismiss him when a disturbance from one of the stables caught everyone's attention. A stable hand rushed in, panic evident in his voice. "Mr. Blackwood, it's Midnight Champion. Something's wrong. He won't put weight on." His back leg. Richard's face drained of color. Midnight Champion was his prized stallion, worth millions and favored to win the upcoming derby. "Get Dr. Reynolds here, now," Richard barked, already striding toward the stables. Without thinking, Ethan followed, still clutching his basket of vegetables. No one noticed him in the commotion. When they reached the stall, the magnificent black thoroughbred was clearly in distress, his powerful body trembling slightly as he avoided putting weight on his rear left leg. He was fine during morning exercises, a young stable hand named Tyler explained nervously. "Just started acting up about 20 minutes ago." Richard paced anxiously while they waited for the veterinarian. His phone buzzed constantly, but he ignored it, eyes fixed on his valuable investment. Ethan observed quietly from the back of the small crowd that had gathered. He noticed how the horse shifted its weight, the subtle way it held its head. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said softly. All heads turned toward him, expressions ranging from surprise to annoyance at his continued presence. "You might want to check his hoof. The way he's distributing his weight suggests it's not the leg itself." "And what would you know about thoroughbreds?" Richard asked coldly. Ethan shrugged. "Animals are animals. They tell you what's wrong if you know how to look." Richard was about to order him removed when the veterinarian still hadn't arrived after another 10 minutes. Growing increasingly agitated, he finally gestured toward Ethan. "Fine, take a look. But if you harm my horse in any way, The threat hung unfinished as Ethan set down his basket and approached the stallion slowly. He spoke in soft, soothing tones, letting the animal catch his scent before gently running his hands down the trembling leg. With practiced movements, he lifted the hoof and examined it carefully. "Here's your problem," he said after a moment. "There's a stone bruise forming and a small crack starting. He needs proper treatment right away, or it could develop into something worse." The stable hands exchanged confused glances. How could they have missed this? Richard stared at Ethan with narrowed eyes. "What kind of treatment?" he asked, skepticism evident in his voice. Ethan detailed a simple but effective treatment plan that made use of both modern veterinary techniques and old-fashioned remedies. When Dr. Reynolds finally arrived 30 minutes later, he confirmed Ethan's diagnosis and recommended almost exactly the same treatment. As the veterinarian applied the treatments, Richard pulled Ethan aside. His demeanor slightly changed. "Where did you learn about horses?" "Here and there," Ethan replied vaguely. "Been around animals all my life." Richard studied him for a long moment. "Leave your information with Jessica. We might have use for your expertise." Again, Ethan nodded, picked up his basket of now-forgotten vegetables, and walked back through the stables. On his way out, he passed a young woman with auburn hair who had been watching the entire scene unfold. Samantha Collins, barely 22 and new to the stable staff, looked at him with undisguised curiosity. "Thank you," she said simply as he passed by. "That was Midnight Champion, Mr. Blackwood's most valuable horse." Ethan smiled briefly. "Just doing what anyone would do." "Not anyone," Samantha replied. "No one else saw it." As Ethan drove away in his battered pickup truck, Samantha watched from the entrance, a thoughtful expression on her face. There was something about the humble farmer that didn't quite fit, a knowledge and confidence that seemed at odds with his weathered appearance and modest demeanor. News of the incident spread quickly through Oak Ridge. By the following week, when Midnight Champion had recovered completely, Richard grudgingly called Ethan back to examine another horse, and then another. Each time, Ethan demonstrated a remarkable knowledge of equine health, genetics, and behavior, the kind of expertise that usually came with expensive education and years of professional experience. The stable hands began to treat him with cautious respect. Even Mark, the stable manager, stopped sneering when Ethan arrived. Only Richard maintained his distance, watching the farmer with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion that grew more pronounced with each visit. Samantha found herself increasingly intrigued by the mystery of Ethan Miller. During his 5th visit to Oak Ridge, she overheard him discussing complex genetic lineages with one of the breeding specialists, using terminology and concepts that left even the expert impressed. "Where did you study genetics?" the specialist asked. "Never did formally," Ethan replied with a small smile. "Just picked things up along the way." That evening, after her shift ended, Samantha made a decision. Instead of heading to her small apartment in town, she followed Ethan's truck as it wound its way through the Kentucky countryside, maintaining a discreet distance. The road eventually led to a modest property on the outskirts of a neighboring county, a small cottage surrounded by a vegetable garden and a few fruit trees. Samantha parked her car a distance away and approached on foot, feeling both curious and guilty for spying. Through the window, she could see Ethan moving about inside, preparing a simple dinner. There was nothing suspicious about the scene, yet something compelled her to look deeper. She circled the cottage, peering cautiously through windows. In what appeared to be a bedroom, she spotted a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. When Ethan moved to another part of the house, Samantha made an impulsive decision. She tried the window and found it unlocked. Heart racing, she slipped inside and quickly moved to the chest. Inside, beneath layers of old clothing, she found a metal box. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing documents, newspaper clippings, and a faded photograph. The photograph showed a younger Ethan standing proudly beside another man, a man whose features were strikingly similar to Richard Blackwood's. Both were smiling, dressed in riding clothes, with a handsome horse between them. Scrawled on the back were the words, Ethan and William Blackwood, Springhaven Farm, 1989. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. William Blackwood, Richard's father. The documents in the box told a more complete story. Property deeds, partnership agreements, and court papers. According to these records, Ethan had once owned Springhaven Farm, a successful breeding operation that bordered what was now Oakridge Stables. A noise from the front of the cottage startled her. Quickly replacing everything and closing the chest, Samantha slipped back out the window just as Ethan returned to the bedroom. She ran back to her car, mind racing with questions. Meanwhile, at Oakridge, Richard Blackwood sat in his opulent office staring at a folder on his desk. Inside were the results of a private investigation into Ethan Miller's background, an investigation he had commissioned after the farmer's third visit. The report confirmed what Richard had begun to suspect. Ethan Miller was not just some random local farmer. 25 years ago, he had been Ethan Miller of Springhaven Farm, one of the most promising young horse breeders in Kentucky. His operation had mysteriously collapsed amidst accusations of fraud and mounting debts right after a failed partnership with James Blackwood, Richard's older brother. What the report didn't explain was why Ethan had returned now, or why he seemed to harbor no resentment toward the Blackwood family despite losing everything. Richard slammed the folder shut, a cold anger building inside him. Whatever game Ethan Miller was playing, Richard was determined to end it before it threatened everything he had built. The following morning, Samantha arrived at Oakridge Stables earlier than usual, her mind still processing what she had discovered. The grand facility was quiet in the dawn light, with only a few early shift workers moving about the stables. She slipped into the administrative building and made her way to the records room. As one of the newer employees, Samantha didn't have official access to the archives, but she had befriended Lucy, the elderly receptionist who had worked for the Blackwood family for decades. Lucy had a soft spot for the young woman and had shared the door code during a particularly busy day. Just looking for the breeding records for Starlight Express, Samantha had told herself, justifying the breach of protocol. But her fingers trembled as she bypassed the current files and headed for the oldest section of records, those dating back to the early 1990s. After 20 minutes of searching, she found what she was looking for, a thin folder labeled Springhaven Acquisition. Inside were documents detailing the purchase of a neighboring property following a bankruptcy auction. The previous owner was listed as Ethan Miller, and the buyer was Blackwood Enterprises, specifically James Blackwood, acting as CEO. What caught her attention, however, was a handwritten note paperclip to one of the documents. In a hasty scrawl it read, "Final payment to Thompson approved, all records secured. EM has no recourse." The initials at the bottom, JB, matched the signature on the official documents. "What are you doing in here?" The sharp voice made Samantha jump. She turned to find Mark Wilson, the stable manager, standing in the doorway, his expression suspicious. I needed to check some breeding records for the new foals," she stammered, quickly closing the folder and sliding it back into the cabinet. Mark's eyes narrowed. "Those aren't breeding records. That cabinet holds historical property documents." I got turned around. "The filing system is confusing," Samantha said, forcing a smile. "I should get to work. The morning feed is waiting." She tried to move past him, but Mark blocked her way. "Mr. Blackwood doesn't appreciate staff members snooping where they don't belong," he said coldly, "especially when they're spending time with suspicious characters." Samantha's heart raced. "What are you talking about?" "You were seen talking to that farmer yesterday. A bit too friendly, some thought," Mark's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Blackwood is protective of Oak Ridge's reputation. Remember that. He stepped aside, allowing her to pass, but his warning lingered in the air between them. Samantha hurried to the stables, her mind racing. The note she had seen confirmed her suspicions. There was more to Ethan's story than anyone knew, and whatever had happened between him and the Blackwood family hadn't been honest business. Throughout the morning, Samantha went through her duties, mechanically grooming horses and cleaning stalls while processing what she had learned. Around noon, she heard excited voices near the main entrance. Ethan Miller had arrived again, this time summoned by Richard himself to examine a pregnant mare showing signs of distress. Samantha watched from a distance as Ethan worked. His hands moved with gentle confidence, his voice soothing the nervous animal. Within half an hour, he had stabilized the mare's condition and provided Richard with a detailed care plan. The stable's regular veterinarian, arriving late as usual, could only nod in agreement with Ethan's assessment. As Ethan prepared to leave, Richard walked with him toward the entrance, their conversation appearing civil but tense. Samantha managed to position herself near enough to overhear snippets. "Your expertise has been valuable," Richard was saying, his tone carefully measured. "I'd like to offer you a more permanent arrangement, a consulting fee, quite generous." Ethan seemed to consider this, his weathered face revealing nothing. "I'm not looking for permanent work, Mr. Blackwood, just helping where I can." "Everyone has a price," Richard insisted, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Name yours." "Not everything's about money," Ethan replied quietly. "Some things are about making things right." Richard's expression hardened. "Is that what this is about? Making things right?" Before Ethan could respond, they moved out of earshot. Samantha returned to her duties, but her curiosity had only intensified. When her shift ended that evening, she made an impulsive decision. Instead of heading home, she drove to Ethan's cottage. This time, she approached openly, parking in his driveway and knocking on the door. Ethan answered, surprise evident on his face when he recognized her. "Miss Collins, isn't it?" he said, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "What brings you out here?" "I think you know who I am," Samantha said, gathering her courage. "But I don't know who you really are, or rather who you were." Ethan's expression shifted subtly, a wariness entering his eyes. "You'd better come in." The interior of the cottage was simple but comfortable, with furniture that had seen better days but was meticulously maintained. On the walls hung a few photographs, landscape scenes mostly, but Samantha spotted one small frame showing the same horse from the photo she'd found in the box. "That was Silver Song," Ethan said, following her gaze. "Best thoroughbred I ever raised. Would have been a champion if things had turned out differently." "You were a horse breeder," Samantha stated, taking a seat at the small kitchen table. "You owned Springhaven Farm." Ethan nodded slowly, pouring 2 cups of coffee and joining her at the table. 25 years ago. Seems like another lifetime now." "What happened?" "The records show bankruptcy, but there's more to it, isn't there?" Ethan studied her for a long moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "You've been digging. That could be dangerous at Oak Ridge." "I found a note in the acquisition files, something about final payment to Thompson and EM has no recourse. Signed by JB. Ethan's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "James Blackwood, Richard's older brother." "What did he do?" Samantha pressed. "James and I were partners. Briefly," Ethan began, his voice taking on a distant quality. "Springhaven was struggling after a bad season, and the Blackwoods had money to invest. William, their father, believed in me. He thought our farms would complement each other. But James had other ideas. James was always the ambitious one. Richard was still in college then. James saw an opportunity to expand by absorbing my operation rather than partnering with it." Ethan's voice remained even, but his eyes reflected old pain. Documents were falsified. Loans appeared in my name that I never took out. My signature forged on contracts I never saw. And this Thompson person? My accountant. I trusted him completely. Turns out James was paying him to manipulate the books. Samantha shook her head in disbelief. That's fraud. Why didn't you fight it? A sad smile crossed Ethan's face. I tried, but James had connections everywhere. Banks, county offices, even the local courts. By the time I realized what was happening, I was drowning in debt with no legal recourse. The evidence had been carefully constructed against me. So you lost everything. Everything except my dignity, Ethan said quietly. I could have gone public, created a scandal, but William was already ill by then. He'd been good to me, and I couldn't bring myself to drag his family name through the mud while he was suffering. So you just walked away? I took what little they couldn't legally take from me and started over. Bought this small place, grew vegetables, took odd jobs, training horses at smaller farms. Made a quiet life. Samantha leaned forward. But now you're back at Oak Ridge. Why, after all this time? Ethan was silent for a long moment. I heard William had passed away, and then I saw an article about Oak Ridge's expansion plans. They're planning to develop the old Springhaven property into a luxury equestrian resort. Something about that felt wrong, like the final erasure of everything I'd built. So you came to, what? Get revenge? Ethan shook his head firmly. No, I came to bear witness, to make sure that something of Springhaven's legacy survives, even if it's just in the bloodlines of the horses I help save. Does Richard know who you are? He was just a college kid when it all happened, but he must suspect by now. James. He passed away 5 years ago, but the files still exist. Ethan's gaze was steady. The question is, what are you going to do with this information, Miss Collins? Samantha hesitated. I don't know yet, but what they did to you wasn't right. Life rarely is, Ethan replied with a small shrug. But I've made my peace with it. Have you? Samantha challenged gently. Then why come back at all? Before Ethan could answer, his phone rang. He answered it, his expression growing serious as he listened. After a brief conversation, he hung up and looked at Samantha. That was Tyler from Oak Ridge. Midnight Champion is colicking badly. They need help, right away. As they rushed to their vehicles, Samantha had one more question. If Richard offers to buy you out, to make you go away, will you take it? Ethan's response was quiet, but resolute. Some things can't be bought, Miss Collins. Some things need to be earned back. Back at Oak Ridge, chaos reigned as they arrived. Midnight Champion, the stable's most valuable stallion, was thrashing in his stall, his condition deteriorating rapidly. The veterinarian had been called but was still an hour away. Richard paced anxiously outside the stall, his usual composure shattered by the prospect of losing his prized investment. When he saw Ethan and Samantha arrive together, his eyes narrowed suspiciously, but desperation overrode his mistrust. Help him, he demanded of Ethan, whatever you need to do. For the next 2 hours, Ethan worked tirelessly to save the horse, applying treatments and techniques that combined modern veterinary science with old-fashioned horse sense. Samantha assisted, following his instructions precisely. By the time the veterinarian arrived, Midnight Champion had stabilized. As dawn broke over Oak Ridge, Richard approached Ethan, who was sitting exhausted on a bale of hay. The night's emergency had temporarily suspended the tension between them. I owe you, Richard said stiffly. Again. Ethan shook his head. You don't owe me anything. It was about the horse, not you. Nevertheless, Richard continued, I'd like to compensate you properly. He named a sum that made Samantha's eyes widen. That's very generous, Ethan acknowledged, but I don't need your money. Richard's facade of gratitude cracked. Then what do you want? Why are you really here? A long silence stretched between them, charged with unspoken history. Finally, Ethan stood up, facing Richard directly for the first time. "I want back what was taken from me," he said simply. "Not all of it, just the core of Springhaven, the breeding program I built, the legacy that should have been mine." Richard's face hardened. "Impossible. That land is already slated for development." "I'm not talking about the land," Ethan clarified. "I'm talking about recognition, acknowledgement of what was done, and a chance to continue the bloodlines I started." Before Richard could respond, a commotion at the stable entrance interrupted them. Mark Wilson was escorting an elderly man toward them, his expression triumphant. "Mr. Blackwood," Mark called out, "you need to hear what Mr. Thompson has to say about our visitor." Samantha's breath caught. Thompson, the accountant mentioned in the note. The man, James Blackwood, had paid off. "I think we've all heard enough stories for one night," she interrupted, stepping forward protectively. "Midnight Champion needs rest, and so do we all." Richard's calculating gaze shifted between Samantha, Ethan, and the newcomer. Slowly, a cold smile spread across his face. "On the contrary, Miss Collins, I think it's time we heard the whole story." He turned to the elderly man. "Mr. Thompson, please tell us about your history with Mr. Miller here." Thompson straightened, his shoulders avoiding Ethan's gaze. "I was Mr. Miller's accountant when he owned Springhaven Farm. I can testify that he engaged in fraudulent practices that led to the farm's financial collapse." Ethan's face remained impassive, but Samantha could see his hands clench slightly. The lie hung in the air between them all, a challenge that couldn't be ignored. "That's not true," Samantha blurted out. "I found the note in your files. James Blackwood paid him to falsify records." Richard's expression darkened. "You've been going through confidential files. That's grounds for immediate dismissal, Miss Collins." "Fire me if you want," Samantha replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But it won't change the truth." The standoff was interrupted by Tyler, who rushed into the stable area. "Mr. Blackwood, the investors are here early. They're waiting in the main conference room." Richard glanced at his watch and cursed under his breath. The planned presentation to potential investors for the resort development couldn't be postponed. He pointed a warning finger at Ethan. "This isn't over. Stay away from my stables and my employees." His gaze shifted to Samantha. "And you, clear out your locker today. You're done at Oak Ridge." As Richard strode away, Thompson shuffling after him, Samantha turned to Ethan, panic finally setting in. "I just lost my job," she said, the reality of her situation hitting her. "All because I stood up for you." Ethan's weathered face showed regret and gratitude in equal measure. "I never asked you to do that." "No," she agreed, "but someone needed to speak the truth." She took a deep breath. "So what happens now?" "Now," Ethan said quietly, "we find evidence that even Richard Blackwood can't ignore." The Kentucky sun beat down mercilessly as Samantha cleared out her small locker at Oak Ridge Stables. After 2 years of dedicated work, everything she owned at the prestigious facility fit into a single cardboard box. A few of her fellow stable hands offered sympathetic glances, but most kept their distance, afraid of associating with someone who had fallen from Richard Blackwood's favor. Only Tyler, the youngest stable hand, dared to approach her directly. "It's not right," he said quietly, helping her carry the box to her car. "Everyone knows you're the best with the horses." Samantha managed a small smile. "Thanks, Tyler, but we both know this isn't about my job performance." Tyler glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "Is it true about that farmer and Springhaven?" "Parts of it," she replied cautiously, "but there's more to the story than most people know." "Well, for what it's worth, I believe you." Tyler shuffled his feet. "And I'm not the only one. Some of the older hands remember Springhaven Farm. They say it was something special." As Samantha drove away from Oak Ridge for what might be the last time, her thoughts tumbled chaotically. She had sacrificed her job, her career potentially, for a man she barely knew, and a cause she'd only just discovered. What had possessed her to challenge Richard Blackwood so openly? Her apartment in Lexington felt suffocatingly small after the open spaces of the stables. Sitting at her kitchen table, surrounded by equestrian textbooks and half-finished job applications, Samantha tried to figure out her next move. The logical choice would be to distance herself from Ethan Miller and his problems, to salvage what she could of her professional reputation. Instead, she found herself dialing a number. Lexington. Public Library? Yes, I'm wondering if you have archives of the local newspapers from the early 1990s, specifically anything related to Springhaven Farm or the Blackwood family. 3 hours later, surrounded by microfiche printouts and photocopied articles in the library's research room, Samantha began to piece together the public side of Ethan's story. The headlines told a straightforward tale. Local breeder faces financial collapse. Springhaven Farm auction announced. Blackwood Enterprises expands with new acquisition. But between the lines, there were inconsistencies that nagged at her. Why had Springhaven's financial troubles appeared so suddenly, with no warning signs in previous business reports? How had James Blackwood secured the winning bid so quickly when the auction was supposedly open to all interested parties? And most curiously, why had several key county officials involved in the bankruptcy proceedings resigned or relocated shortly after the farm changed hands? As the library prepared to close, an elderly librarian approached Samantha's table. "Finding what you need?" she asked, glancing at the scattered papers. "Not exactly," Samantha admitted. "I'm looking for information about Springhaven Farm and its sale to the Blackwoods in the early 90s, but there are gaps." The librarian studied her thoughtfully. "You might want to talk to Harold Jenkins. He was a reporter for the Herald back then, covered all the local business news. Retired now, but he keeps an archive of his own. Says the paper didn't always print everything he wrote. Do you know how I could reach him? He runs the Historical Society Museum over in Millfield. Small place, but he's there most days." The next morning, Samantha found herself driving to Millfield, a sleepy town 30 miles from Lexington. The Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian house on a quiet street, its front yard adorned with a faded sign announcing, "Preserving our local heritage." Harold Jenkins was exactly as Samantha had pictured him, a thin man in his 70s with wire-rimmed glasses and the perpetually curious expression of a lifelong journalist. When she explained her interest in Springhaven Farm, his eyes lit up with recognition. "Springhaven," he repeated, leading her to a cluttered back office. "No, that's a name I haven't heard in years. Ethan Miller's place." "You knew him?" Samantha asked eagerly. "Knew of him. Interviewed him a few times for the paper." Harold pulled open a filing cabinet and began rifling through folders. Brilliant. Breeder. Had innovative ideas about bloodlines that some of the old-timers thought were crazy until his horses started winning. "Oh, what happened? Really happened, I mean." Harold glanced up, his expression suddenly guarded. "Why the interest in ancient history, Miss Collins?" Samantha hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Ethan Miller is back. He's been helping at Oak Ridge Stables, where I worked until yesterday. I lost my job for defending him." Harold's eyebrows rose. "Ethan's back in the horse business? Didn't expect that." He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded to himself. "Well, anyone who gets fired by a Blackwood for standing up for Ethan Miller deserves to know the truth." He extracted a thick folder from the cabinet and placed it on the desk between them. Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and several photographs paper-clipped together. "This is my personal file on the Springhaven case. Most of this never made it to print." Harold's voice took on a bitter edge. "The Herald's publisher got a visit from James Blackwood's lawyers the day before my investigative piece was scheduled to run. Suddenly, I was told to drop the story. When I refused, they ran a watered-down version that basically painted Ethan as an incompetent businessman who got in over his head. Samantha leafed through the materials, her heart racing as she saw documentation of exactly what Ethan had described. Falsified loan applications with forged signatures, bank records showing suspicious transfers, and most damning of all, a transcript of an interview with a county clerk who admitted to backdating documents at James Blackwood's request. "This is evidence of fraud," she said, looking up at Harold. "Why didn't Ethan use this to fight back?" Harold sighed heavily. By the time I'd gathered most of this, the bankruptcy was finalized and the property had changed hands. The clerk recanted his statement, claiming I'd misquoted him. The banker suddenly couldn't remember the details of the transactions, and then there was the accident. What accident? William Blackwood, the father, suffered a serious heart attack right in the middle of it all. The whole community rallied around the family, even suggesting that James had done something unethical while his father was in the hospital would have made Ethan look like a vindictive monster. Harold pulled out one last document, a handwritten letter on Springhaven Farm stationery. "Ethan sent me this when he left town, said he was starting fresh somewhere else and didn't want to drag anyone else down with him." The letter, dated weeks after the farm's sale, expressed Ethan's resignation to what had happened and his concern for William Blackwood's health. The final paragraph caught Samantha's attention. "Some battles aren't worth the casualties they create. William was always fair to me, and his legacy shouldn't be tarnished by his son's actions. Perhaps someday the truth will matter again." "May I make copies of these?" Samantha asked, her mind already racing with possibilities. Harold hesitated. "The Blackwoods are still powerful in this county, Miss Collins. Are you sure you want to stir this up?" "The truth matters now," she replied firmly. "It matters to Ethan, and it should matter to everyone who cares about justice." After copying the most crucial documents, Samantha thanked Harold and headed straight to Ethan's cottage. She found him in the garden, tending to his vegetables, with the same careful attention he gave to the horses at Oakridge. "You should have told me everything," she said without preamble, holding up the folder of evidence. Ethan straightened slowly, wiping soil from his hands. "Where did you get those?" "Harold Jenkins kept a file. He had proof of everything James did." Samantha stepped closer. "You could have fought back." "At what cost?" Ethan asked quietly. "William was a good man caught in a bad situation. Fighting his son publicly would have broken him. But now William is gone. James is gone. Only Richard remains, and he's about to erase the last traces of Springhaven with this resort development." Ethan's weathered face showed a flicker of emotion. Richard was just a college kid when it happened. He might not even know the whole truth. "He knows enough to feel threatened by you," Samantha countered. "That's why he tried to buy you off. That's why he fired me." They moved inside the cottage, where Samantha spread the documents across Ethan's kitchen table. For the next hour, they reviewed the evidence together, with Ethan filling in details that even Harold hadn't known. "There's one piece missing," Ethan said finally, tapping a document that mentioned a safe deposit box. "James kept the original partnership agreement between us. It had clauses that would have protected me, which is why he made sure it disappeared during the bankruptcy proceedings." "Ooh, what happened to it?" "James told me he destroyed it. But men like James don't destroy leverage. They hide it." Ethan's expression grew thoughtful. "If it still exists, it would be in the family vault at Oakridge." Samantha's eyes widened. "You think it's still there after all this time?" The Blackwoods never throw away anything that might be useful someday, and that document would be insurance against anyone ever questioning how they acquired Springhaven. Their strategizing was interrupted by a knock at the door. Ethan opened it to find Tyler standing on the porch, looking nervous but determined. "Tyler, what are you doing here?" Adrade, I need to talk to you both, the young stable hand said, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid of being followed. It's about Mr. Blackwood. He's doing something to the horses. Inside, Tyler explained that Richard had been making increasingly erratic decisions about the care of the horses, particularly the pregnant mares. Several valuable animals were showing signs of distress, but Richard had forbidden the staff from calling in outside veterinary help. He says it's nothing serious, but I've been around horses my whole life, Tyler said, his young face etched with concern. Something's wrong, and he won't listen to anyone. Why come to us? Samantha asked. I don't work there anymore. Because everyone knows Mr. Miller is the best with the horses. And because... Tyler hesitated. Because I found something when I was cleaning out the old records room. Something about Springhaven Farm. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to Ethan. It was a faded copy of a letter from William Blackwood to his son James, dated just before the Springhaven bankruptcy. The letter expressed deep disappointment in James's business, tactics, and explicitly forbade any action against Ethan Miller's farm. My father built our family's reputation on honor and fairness, William had written. I will not allow that legacy to be tarnished by underhanded dealings, especially against a man who has been nothing but honest with us. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he read the words. William never knew, he said softly. He tried to stop it. There's more, Tyler said. Mr. Blackwood is having some kind of breakdown. Since the investors visited last week, he's been obsessed with the idea that you're trying to sabotage the resort development. He's talking about destroying all the old records from Springhaven, saying they're contaminated with the past. Samantha and Ethan exchanged alarmed glances. If Richard destroyed those records, any chance of proving what really happened would vanish. We need to act now, Samantha said decisively. Tyler, when is Richard planning to destroy these records? Tomorrow morning. There's a bonfire scheduled for old documentation as part of some cleansing ritual before the groundbreaking ceremony for the resort. Ethan stood up, a new resolve evident in his bearing. I've been passive for 25 years. I won't sit by and watch him erase history completely. He turned to Samantha. But I can't ask you to risk any more for me. You've already lost your job. I didn't lose my job, Samantha replied with a determined smile. I traded it for something more valuable, the truth. Together, the three of them formulated a plan. Tyler would return to Oakridge and continue his duties as normal, keeping an eye on Richard's movements. Samantha would contact Harold Jenkins to see if he would be willing to go public with his evidence, if they could find the original partnership agreement. And Ethan would make one last attempt to reason with Richard directly, appealing to whatever sense of family honor might remain in William Blackwood's younger son. As dusk fell, Tyler left to return to the stables. Samantha lingered, watching. Ethan, as he stood at his kitchen window, gazing toward the distant hills where Springhaven Farm had once thrived. Why did you really come back? She asked softly. After all these years? Ethan was silent for a long moment. I told myself it was to see the horses, to make sure some part of what I built survived. He turned to face her. But the truth is, I came back because running away never felt right. Not fighting for what was mine never felt right. And now? A small smile crossed his face, the most genuine one Samantha had seen from him. Now, I have a second chance to do what I should have done 25 years ago. Not for revenge, but for justice, for truth. As Samantha drove back to her apartment that night, a storm began brewing on the horizon, thunder rumbling across the Kentucky hills like a portent of the confrontation to come. In less than 24 hours, they would make their stand against Richard Blackwood. The stakes were high, not just Ethan's legacy, but the welfare of the horses at Oakridge and the livelihoods of everyone who worked there. What none of them realized was that Richard had his own plans in motion. In his office at Oakridge, he sat reviewing security footage that showed Tyler's visit to Samantha earlier that day. A glass of bourbon sat untouched at his elbow as he picked up his phone. "Thompson," he said when the call connected, "we have a problem. The Miller situation is escalating. I need you to move up our timeline." He paused, listening to the response. "No, tomorrow is too late. It needs to happen tonight." As he hung up, Richard opened his desk drawer and removed a yellow document with 2 signatures at the bottom. His brother James and Ethan Miller, the original partnership agreement that Ethan believed was destroyed decades ago. "Some ghosts refuse to stay buried," Richard murmured, holding the paper over the flame of a candle. "But before the edge could catch fire," he hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. With a sharp exhale, he extinguished the candle and returned the document to the drawer, locking it securely. The truth about Springhaven Farm and the Blackwood family's role in its downfall hung in the balance, awaiting the dawn and the choices that would finally bring a quarter-century of secrets into the light. Dawn broke over the rolling hills of Kentucky horse country, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. At Oakridge Stables, the morning routine was underway. Horses being fed, stalls being cleaned, the rhythmic sounds of an operation that had functioned like clockwork for decades. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Richard Blackwood arrived earlier than usual, his expensive SUV kicking up dust as it roared up the long driveway. He hadn't slept well. The conversation with Thompson the previous night had left him unsettled. For years, he had believed his brother's version of the Springhaven acquisition, a simple business transaction, a failing farm absorbed by the more successful Blackwood operation. The documents in his desk told a different story, one he had refused to fully acknowledge until Ethan Miller's unexpected return forced him to confront it. In the main stable, Tyler worked nervously, his movements jerky and distracted as he kept one eye on the entrance. When Richard strode in, the young stable hand ducked his head, focusing intently on the mare he was grooming. "Tyler," Richard said sharply. "A word." The young man followed his boss to a quiet corner, his heart pounding. Had his visit to Ethan's cottage been discovered? "I understand you've been spending time with Samantha Collins, even after her dismissal," Richard began, his voice deceptively calm. "She was teaching me about breeding lines," Tyler replied, the half-truth sticking in his throat. "She knows more than anyone else who's worked here." Richard studied him for a long moment. "Loyalty is a valuable trait, Tyler, but it needs to be directed appropriately." He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, the gesture more threatening than comforting. "The Blackwood family has employed your family for 3 generations. Remember where your true loyalties should lie." Before Tyler could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught their attention. Ethan Miller had arrived, but not alone. Samantha stood beside him, and behind them was Harold Jenkins, the retired journalist, carrying a leather portfolio. "Mr. Blackwood," Ethan called, his voice carrying across the stable yard. "We need to talk." Richard's expression hardened as he walked toward them. "I believe I made myself clear yesterday, Miller. You're not welcome here." "This isn't about me being welcome," Ethan replied steadily. "This is about setting things right before it's too late." By now, several stable hands had gathered, watching the confrontation with undisguised interest. Richard glanced around, acutely aware of the audience. "My office," he said tersely. "Now." The 4 of them, Richard, Ethan, Samantha, and Harold, moved to the administrative building, where Richard's spacious office overlooked the training rings. As they entered, Richard noticed immediately that his desk drawer had been forced open, the lock broken. The partnership agreement was gone. "Looking for this?" Ethan asked quietly, holding up the yellow document. Richard's face flushed with anger. You broke into my office? That's criminal trespass, Miller. I'll have you arrested." "No one broke in," Tyler said from the doorway where he had followed them. In his hand was a key. "I have access to all the offices for morning cleaning. I found this while organizing the files exactly where it belonged." The young, stable hand stepped forward, his nervousness replaced by determination. "My grandfather worked for your father, Mr. Blackwood. He always said William Blackwood was the most honest man he ever knew. I don't think he would have approved of what happened to Springhaven Farm." Richard sank into his chair, the weight of decades of deception suddenly pressing down on him. "What do you want, Miller? Money? Public humiliation of my family? Revenge for what James did?" "I want the truth acknowledged," Ethan said simply. "I want my name cleared, and I want a chance to finish what I started at Springhaven." Harold Jenkins stepped forward, opening his portfolio. "I have evidence that would make quite a story, Mr. Blackwood. Fraud, forgery, bribery of public officials, all committed by your brother. The statute of limitations has expired on the criminal charges, but the court of public opinion has no such restrictions." "You're threatening me with a smear campaign?" Richard asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "No," Samantha interjected. "We're offering you a chance to do the right thing, a chance your brother never took." For several tense moments, Richard sat in silence, his gaze moving from the partnership agreement to the faces of those standing before him. Finally, he let out a long breath. "James always said father was too soft in business," he said almost to himself. "Too concerned with reputation and honor. I admired my brother's ruthlessness. Until now, I never saw it as the weakness it truly was." He reached for the agreement, and Ethan handed it over without resistance. Richard read it carefully, then placed it on his desk. "This document is legally binding," he admitted. "It contains a clause stating that if either party acted fraudulently against the other, all properties acquired would revert to the wronged party." He looked up at Ethan. "If this became public, Oakridge could be at risk." "I don't want Oakridge," Ethan said firmly. "I never did. I only want what was mine, the original Springhaven property and the breeding program I developed." Richard's brow furrowed. "The resort development is already underway. Contract signed, investors committed. The development is planned for the eastern section," Tyler pointed out. "The original Springhaven stables and the north pastures aren't included in that plan." Richard looked at his young employee with surprise. "You've studied the development plans?" Tyler nodded. "I want to manage the equestrian center someday, sir. I try to learn everything I can about Oakridge operations." A hint of respect showed in Richard's expression before he turned back to Ethan. "Even if I wanted to make this right, how would it work? Springhaven doesn't exist anymore." Samantha stepped forward, placing a folder on the desk. "I've drafted a proposal. Springhaven Farm is re-established on the original northern section of the property. Ethan regains control of his breeding program and works in partnership with Oakridge for mutual benefit. The resort development continues as planned on the eastern section. And most importantly, the truth about what happened 25 years ago is acknowledged, but in a way that emphasizes reconciliation rather than scandal." Richard opened the folder, reviewing the detailed plans inside. "You've thought this through," he said with reluctant admiration. "We believe in second chances," Ethan said quietly, "for everyone involved." Before Richard could respond, his secretary's voice came over the intercom. "Mr. Blackwood, the investors are in the conference room for the final presentation, and the mayor in stall 12 is showing signs of distress." Richard hesitated, clearly torn between the business meeting and the crisis with the horse. "Go to your meeting," Ethan said calmly. "I'll check on the mayor." "Why would you help now?" Richard asked, suspicious. "Because this isn't about you or me," Ethan replied. It's about the horses. It's always been about the horses." Something shifted in Richard's expression then, a recognition of the dedication they shared, despite everything else that divided them. He nodded once and strode from the office, leaving the others to exchange hopeful glances. For the next several hours, while Richard conducted his business meeting, Ethan worked tirelessly to stabilize the distressed mare, one of Oakridge's most valuable breeding females, who had been struggling with her pregnancy. Samantha assisted him, their movements synchronized by a shared understanding of what the animals needed. Tyler ran back and forth, fetching supplies and keeping the other stable hands informed but calm. By mid-afternoon, the mare had stabilized, her vital signs returning to normal, the crisis averted. As Ethan washed up in the stable sink, Richard appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "How is she?" he asked. "She'll be fine," Ethan replied. "The foal too, but she needs specialized care for the remainder of her pregnancy. Her bloodline has a history of these complications." Richard nodded slowly. "You knew that just by looking at her?" "I knew it because I bred her grandsire at Springhaven," Ethan said simply. "Some traits run deep in the bloodlines." A long silence stretched between them, heavy with decades of history and the weight of decisions that had shaped both their lives. "The investors are impressed with the resort plans," Richard said finally. "But they expressed concern about the equestrian component. They want assurances that Oakridge will maintain its reputation for breeding excellence while developing this new venture." "A valid concern," Ethan acknowledged. "It's not easy to balance tradition and innovation." "No, it isn't." Richard's gaze was direct now, the calculation in his eyes replaced by something more genuine. "Which is why they were very interested in my new proposal, a partnership with the revived Springhaven Farm, combining their innovative breeding techniques with Oakridge's resources and facilities." Samantha's eyes widened. "You told them?" "I told them a version of the truth," Richard clarified, "that a valuable partnership had been unwisely abandoned in the past, and that Oakridge was rectifying that mistake by bringing Ethan Miller back into the fold." He turned to Ethan. "The original Springhaven property will be legally returned to you and the breeding program re-established under your direction. In exchange, you will work exclusively with Oakridge, not competitors." The offer hung in the air between them. Ethan studied Richard's face, searching for signs of deception or hidden agendas. "And what about the truth?" Harold Jenkins asked, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the office. "The real truth about how Springhaven was taken?" Richard grimaced slightly. "The official statement will acknowledge that administrative errors and misunderstandings led to the improper acquisition of Springhaven, and that the Blackwood family is pleased to correct this historical injustice." Harold snorted. "That's corporate speak for fraud." It's as much as I can offer without destroying my family's name completely," Richard countered. "James is gone. My father is gone. Their legacies are complicated enough without dragging them through a public scandal that can no longer be rectified with those directly responsible." Ethan nodded slowly. "I can live with that if you add one more thing to the agreement." "What's that?" "Everyone who works at Oakridge is treated with dignity and respect from now on. No more firing people for speaking the truth." Ethan glanced at Samantha. "Starting with reinstating Miss Collins to her position, with a promotion to head of breeding operations for the joint venture." A smile tugged at the corner of Richard's mouth. "You drive a hard bargain for a man who claims not to care about business, Miller." "I care about people who do the right thing, even when it costs them," Ethan replied evenly. Richard extended his hand. "We have a deal." As they shook hands, the tension that had filled the stable seemed to dissipate, replaced by a cautious sense of possibility. Tyler grinned openly, while Samantha and Harold exchanged satisfied nods. "I'll have the lawyers draw up the paperwork immediately," Richard said, already pulling out his phone. "We can make the announcement at tomorrow's groundbreaking ceremony for the resort." Over the next 24 hours, Oakridge Stables transformed. The planned bonfire of old records was cancelled, replaced by an archiving project to properly preserve the history of both Oakridge and Springhaven. Samantha returned to work, and time with an office of her own, and the authority to implement the breeding strategies she and Ethan had discussed. Tyler was promoted to assistant stable manager, his knowledge and loyalty recognized at last. And Ethan Miller walked the northern pastures of what had once been, and would soon be again, Springhaven Farm. The land had changed in 25 years, but the rolling hills and the quality of the soil remained the same. As he crested a familiar rise, he could almost see the stables as they had been, hear the nickering of horses that had once been his pride and joy. "It's beautiful," Samantha said, joining him on the hillside. "I can see why you never truly let it go." Ethan smiled, the weight of decades lifting from his shoulders. Some connections can't be broken, no matter how hard people try to sever them. The land remembers. The bloodlines remember. "And now everyone else will remember too," she said, slipping her hand into his. "The truth has a way of coming to light, even if it takes time." The groundbreaking ceremony the next day was attended by local media, investors, and the entire staff of Oakridge. Richard Blackwood stood at the podium, uncharacteristically humble, as he announced the partnership with the revitalized Springhaven Farm and introduced Ethan as a visionary whose contributions to Kentucky horse breeding would finally receive the recognition they deserved. As cameras flashed and reporters took notes, Richard stepped aside, allowing Ethan to address the crowd. The once humble farmer spoke with quiet confidence about his vision for the future, a future that honored the past while embracing innovation, that valued the welfare of the animals above profit margins, and that recognized the contributions of everyone involved in the operation, from stable hands to trainers. Springhaven and Oakridge will demonstrate that success doesn't have to come at the expense of integrity, Ethan concluded, and that it's never too late to make things right. The applause that followed was genuine, especially from the Oakridge employees who had witnessed the transformation of their workplace in just a few short days. Even Thompson, the former accountant who had helped James Blackwood orchestrate the original fraud, stood at the back of the crowd, a look of something like relief on his aged face. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Richard approached Ethan one last time. "My father would have approved of this," he said quietly. "He always spoke highly of you, even after everything happened. I think he suspected what James had done, but couldn't bring himself to confront it." "William was a good man caught in a difficult situation," Ethan replied. "I never blamed him." Richard nodded, a rare vulnerability showing in his expression. "I've spent my life trying to live up to my brother's version of success. It never occurred to me that he might have been wrong about what success truly means." With that, he walked away, leaving Ethan to contemplate how differently things might have turned out if such a conversation had happened 25 years earlier. 6 months later, the first foals of the new Springhaven breeding program were born. Ethan and Samantha, now partners in both business and life, stood watching as a leggy colt took his first wobbling steps across the straw-covered stall floor. "He has his great-grandsire's markings," Ethan observed, his voice soft with wonder. "The bloodline endures." "Just like the truth," Samantha replied, leaning against his shoulder. "It may get buried for a while, but it always finds its way back to the surface." Outside, the expanded Oakridge Springhaven operation flourished. The resort development brought new visitors to the area, many of whom came specifically to see the historic breeding facility that had risen from the ashes of injustice. Tyler had proven himself an exceptional stable manager, earning the respect of both Richard and Ethan with his dedication and integrity. And Richard Blackwood, somewhat to everyone's surprise, had embraced the partnership wholeheartedly. The acknowledgement of past wrongs seemed to have freed him from his brother's shadow, allowing him to develop his own leadership style, one that valued honor and fairness, as his father had once done. As for Harold Jenkins, the retired journalist finally published his story about Springhaven Farm, not as an exposé of corruption, but as a testament to perseverance, to the power of truth to overcome deception, and to the possibility of redemption even after decades of injustice. The final paragraph of his article, which hung framed in the entrance to the new Springhaven stables, summed it up perfectly. In the world of thoroughbred racing, bloodlines are everything. But Ethan Miller has proven that the most valuable inheritance isn't found in genetic code or legal documents. It's found in the unbreakable dignity of a person who refuses to descend to the level of those who wronged him, who chooses justice over vengeance, and who understands that true prosperity comes not from what we possess, but from what we restore. And in the rolling hills of Kentucky horse country, where the reputation of a handshake once meant more than any written contract, that lesson resonated deeply. A reminder that the most valuable legacies are built not on acquisition and expansion, but on honor, patience, and the courage to fight for what is right. Dear listeners, we hope Ethan and Samantha's journey from injustice to redemption has touched your hearts. Their story reminds us that integrity and perseverance can triumph even when all seems lost. To continue this emotional experience, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating tales of resilience and second chances. Find it by clicking the link on your left. If you enjoyed this story of dignity and justice prevailing in Kentucky horse country, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore life's complexities and the power of the human spirit. Don't miss our upcoming content that will move and inspire you. We're waiting to hear your thoughts in the comments below.